All right, so you ready to dive into another Goosebumps classic? This time it's The Ghost Next Door. It's the one, with the super creepy cover art.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Definitely gave me a few sleepless nights as a kid.
Yeah, same here. I remember just staring at it in the bookstore, like half fascinated, half terrified.
Totally. So, what are we looking at today to, crack the case on this one?
Well, we've got this really interesting blog review from someone who read it as a kid and recently revisited it. Plus, the usual Goodreads insights, and of course the book itself.
Nice. That's a pretty solid lineup. So, what's the mission for this deep dive? Are we trying to decide if The Ghost Next Door is still worth reading all these years later?
Yeah, basically. Is it just nostalgia talking, or is there something genuinely creepy and compelling about this book that holds up even today? Especially compared to other books in the series, right? Like, where does it rank among the Goosebumps greats?
Okay, I like it. So, are we starting with the blog review then?
Let's do it. And just to get right to the point, the reviewer gave it a 4.5 out of 5.
Wow, 4.5. That's pretty impressive, especially from someone who read it as a kid and could easily be, overly critical as an adult.
Right. Like, how many things we loved as kids totally flopped when we revisited them? Remember those Care Bears movies?
Oh, God, yeah. Those did not age well. Okay, so this reviewer is saying The Ghost Next Door is more than just a nostalgic trip.
Definitely. They praised the book's emotional depth and lasting impact. They even said it was scarier than they remembered.
Interesting. So it's not just cheap thrills, there's some substance to this one.
That seems to be the consensus. In fact, the reviewer compared it to, get this, The Sixth Sense.
Whoa, hold on. The Sixth Sense. We're talking about a Goosebumps book here, right?
I know, right? I was surprised too. But apparently there are some pretty strong similarities, especially in terms of the twist ending.
Okay, now you've got to elaborate on that. What kind of twist are we talking about? Don't spoil it completely, but give me a hint.
Well, let's just say it involves a similar reveal about the main character's true nature. And just like in The Sixth Sense, it's done really well, with little clues sprinkled throughout the story.
All right, now I'm really intrigued. I definitely don't remember picking up on any of those clues when I was a kid.
Right. It's like reading it with fresh eyes as an adult.
Ah.
So the reviewer talked about these unsettling dreams that the main character, Hannah, keeps having.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this mysterious boy next door, Danny, who appears and disappears at odd times.
Okay, yeah, I vaguely remember those parts. And wasn't there also something about a creepy shadow figure?
Exactly. That creepy shadow figure that only Hannah can see. The reviewer said it was one of the things that freaked them out the most as a kid.
Yeah, I can see why. That image is burned into my memory from the cover art. Just looking at it was enough to send chills down my spine. But I'm curious about this whole ghost situation. Does the reviewer explain how that works?
They do mention it, but they also point out that some of the plot mechanics around the ghost situation are a bit unclear on a second read. Like the details about Hannah's family and how they fit into her ghost existence are kind of murky.
Interesting. So it's one of those things that might not hold up to too much scrutiny.
Yeah, maybe. But the reviewer also says that it doesn't really detract from the overall creepiness and emotional impact of the story.
Okay, that makes sense. Sometimes it's best not to overthink the logic in these kinds of stories, right? Just go with the flow and enjoy the ride. But speaking of logic, did the reviewer mention anything about the fire that killed Hannah and her family? I always thought that was a pretty heavy topic for a Goosebumps book, especially for its target audience.
Yeah, the reviewer brought that up too. They actually said that it's one of the things that makes The Ghost Next Door stand out from other Goosebumps books. It deals with death and grief in a way that's surprisingly mature for a book aimed at young readers.
Right, I remember that being a bit of a shocker when I first read it. Like, wow, this is getting real. I'm guessing that's part of the reason the reviewer compared it to The Sixth Sense. Both stories deal with those darker, more psychological aspects of the supernatural.
Exactly. It's not just about jump scares and monsters. It's about exploring those deeper, more unsettling themes.
That's so interesting. It really makes you think about how R.L. Stine was able to tap into those childhood anxieties in a way that was both entertaining and, kind of messed up at the same time.
Yeah, totally. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the writing itself.
Hmm.
Is it actually good, or is it just the nostalgia talking? Like, does Stine's writing hold up as an adult?
Good question. I'm actually curious to hear what the reviewer thought about that. What did they say?
Well, they actually said that the writing is surprisingly nuanced for a children's horror book.
Really? So it's not just like cheesy monster descriptions and over-the-top dialogue?
Nope. They specifically mentioned how Stine captures the voice of a preteen girl really well.
Oh, yeah, Hannah, right.
Uh,
The main character. Exactly. Like her loneliness, her boredom, that awkward crush she has on Danny. The reviewer said it all felt very authentic.
Huh. That's pretty cool. It's like, even though it's a horror story, it still feels grounded in reality.
Right. And you know what else is interesting? The reviewer pointed out that both Hannah and Danny went to Maple Avenue Middle School.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, just like the reviewer did.
No way.
Yeah.
That's such a weird coincidence. It's like R.L. Stine was spying on their childhood or something?
Uh-huh. Right. It's those little personal touches that make the story even creepier, you know? Like it could happen to anyone, even you.
Okay, that's kind of freaky.
Wow.
But so we've got Hannah. She's well written. We've got Danny. But what about the other characters? Did they get any depth, or is it all just focused on Hannah?
Well, the reviewer didn't go into too much detail about the supporting characters, but they did say that Danny is actually pretty complex, too.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, he's struggling to fit in with this rough crowd, which leads him into some dangerous situations.
Oh, that's rough. Poor Danny.
Yeah. And it adds another layer of tension to the story, right? You're not just worried about Hannah's safety, you're worried about Danny's, too.
Totally. It's like double the stakes.
Exactly. And speaking of stakes, how's the pacing? Does the story drag at all, or is it a quick read?
Well, according to the reviewer, it's a pretty quick read.
Which is typical for Goosebumps, right? Those books are like perfectly sized for a spooky afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. But what's impressive is how much Stine manages to pack into such a short story.
Totally. He doesn't waste a single word. Every scene, every detail contributes to the overall atmosphere of creepiness and suspense.
So it's like a perfectly crafted horror short story, but for kids.
Exactly. And that's probably why it continues to resonate with readers even today, you know?
All right, I'm definitely intrigued. But before we get too deep into the analysis, let's see what the Goodreads community has to say. Do they agree with our blog reviewer?
Well, according to Goodreads, The Ghost Next Door is ranked 11th out of 62 books in the original Goosebumps series.
11th. Wow, that's pretty high up there.
Yeah, it's definitely a fan favorite, but the reviews are pretty diverse, which is to be expected with any popular book, right?
Totally. Like some people love it, some people hate it, and everyone else is somewhere in between.
Exactly. So, some readers found it predictable, which, you know, I can kind of see that. Some of those Goosebumps plots can be a bit formulaic.
Yeah, true. But what about the people who loved it? What were they praising?
Well, a lot of them were blown away by the ending, which makes sense considering all this talk about a Sixth Sense level twist.
Right. It seems like that's the big draw for this one. But were there any other common threads in the positive reviews?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people praised the book's emotional depth and the way it tackles those more mature themes.
Like grief, guilt, and all that?
Exactly. They also mentioned the satisfying ending. Apparently, it wraps things up really well.
Nice. But of course, no book is perfect, right?
Yeah.
What about the negative reviews? Were there any major criticisms?
Yeah, some people pointed out those inconsistencies we talked about earlier, like the whole murky ghost situation with Hannah's family.
Right, right. That seems to be a recurring point of contention.
Yeah.
But overall, it sounds like the good outweighs the bad.
Yeah, for sure. Most of the Goodreads reviewers seem to agree that The Ghost Next Door delivers those classic Goosebumps chills, but with a little extra depth and emotion thrown in.
Okay, so it's not just our nostalgic blog reviewer who's singing its praises. Sounds like this one has genuinely stood the test of time.
It really does. You know, it's funny, we were talking about The Sixth Sense earlier, but are there any other books or movies that come to mind when you think about The Ghost Next Door?
That's a good question. Now that you mention it, the others with Nicole Kidman has a similar vibe, you know? All that isolation, the supernatural stuff, and those big twists and turns.
Oh, yeah, totally. I love that movie. It's so creepy and suspenseful. Now that you mention it, I can totally see the parallels. Both stories keep you guessing until the very end.
Right. Like, is it all in their heads? Are they really seeing ghosts? You're constantly questioning what's real and what's not. Okay, so back to The Ghost Next Door. Is there anything else that makes it stand out from other Goosebumps books besides the themes and the twist?
Ooh, good question. One thing that really struck me, even as a kid, was how Stine used the setting to create this feeling of unease, you know?
Oh, like how he described the neighborhood.
Exactly. Hannah's neighborhood is like strangely empty and quiet, almost like a ghost town. Even the weather seems to reflect her emotional state, all dark clouds and thunderstorms.
It's like the environment itself is part of the horror, right? Like a
Right.
reflection of Hannah's isolation.
Exactly. You start to question your own surroundings, wondering if there might be something, you know, lurking beneath the surface.
And that's way creepier than just a haunted house or a spooky graveyard, right?
Right.
Because it feels more relatable, more possible.
Exactly. It plays on those childhood fears of the unknown, those things that go bump in the night.
Speaking of childhood fears, I think Stine really nailed the whole preteen angst thing in this book.
Oh, yeah, totally. The reviewer even specifically called it out how authentic it felt.
Like that boredom, the awkward crushes, that feeling of being stuck in a routine.
Yeah.
It's all very relatable, even all these years later.
He really captures that specific preteen angst, doesn't he? Like that feeling of not quite fitting in, of being on the cusp of something, but not sure what.
It's like he understands what it feels like to be that age, all those confusing emotions, and, like you said, that underlying anxiety.
Right. And it makes the scary stuff even scarier because it's layered on top of all that real-life stuff that kids are already dealing with.
Okay, so we've talked about the plot, the characters, the themes, the atmosphere, even the Goodreads reviews.
Hmm.
But what about the TV adaptation? You mentioned earlier that it wasn't as good as the book, right?
Yeah, I did. Honestly, the TV adaptation, while entertaining, just doesn't capture that same level of creepiness and nuance as the book, you know?
Really? Like, what was missing?
It relied way too much on visual scares and special effects, which, can be effective in their own way.
But they lack the subtlety of the book.
Exactly. They lack that slow burn, that psychological depth that Stine builds so well through his writing.
So it's a classic case of the book was better.
Pretty much. Which, let's be honest, is often the case with adaptations, especially when it comes to horror. It's hard to translate that internal dread and unease onto the screen.
Yeah, sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things we can't see, the things that are left to our imagination.
Right, exactly. And The Ghost Next Door, with all its focus on psychological suspense and those subtle clues, it's a perfect example of that.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the book's strengths, its weaknesses, its similarities to other stories, even that less than stellar TV adaptation. But let's cut to the chase. What's the final verdict? Is The Ghost Next Door worth my time?
If you're looking for a quick, creepy read that's more than just like surface level scares, then absolutely yes.
Okay, I'm sold. I'm adding it to my reading list right now.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what about younger readers? Would you recommend this one to them, or is it a bit too intense?
That's a good question. It really depends on, the kid, like how mature they are and how sensitive they are to scary stuff.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, some kids can handle anything, and others get freaked out by, like, Scooby-Doo.
Right, exactly. So, the themes of death and grief in The Ghost Next Door, those might be a bit too much for some younger readers, especially if, they've personally dealt with loss in their own lives.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely a heavier topic than, say, The Haunted Mask or something.
Totally. But for, older kids and teens who are into psychological thrillers and stuff, I think it's a fantastic choice. It introduces those heavier topics, but in a way that's engaging and thought-provoking.
Right. So maybe not a bedtime story for the little ones, but definitely something for, like, middle-grade readers who are ready for a bit more of a challenge.
Exactly. It's a good example of how horror can be more than just jump scares and monsters, It can actually be a way to explore complex emotions and ask big questions about life and death.
Speaking of big questions,
Hmm.
you mentioned earlier that this book is surprisingly sophisticated for a Goosebumps story.
Uh,
What did you mean by that? Like, what makes it stand out from the rest of the series?
well, I think one of the things is the writing itself is more nuanced. Stine doesn't shy away from symbolism and metaphors and stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Oh.
Got any examples?
Yeah, so there's this recurring motif of the empty swing set across the street from Hannah's house.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was
Yeah.
always mentioned, like, super creepily.
Right, and it represents Hannah's loneliness and isolation. It's subtle, but adds to the whole feeling of unease and foreshadows that big reveal later on.
Wow, I never even thought of it that way. It's like Stein was dropping these hints all along, making you question everything.
Exactly. It's those little things that elevate the book beyond a simple, monster of the week formula. It's a story that makes you think, even after you've finished it.
Okay, so last question before we wrap up. If someone really enjoys The Ghost Next Door, what other books would you recommend to them? Now, we already talked about the others, but are there any other similar reads that come to mind?
Good question. Well, if they liked the whole, ghost story aspect and the exploration of grief and all that, I'd recommend Wait Till Helen Comes.
Who's that by?
It's by Mary Downing Hahn. It's another middle-grade ghost story with a strong female protagonist and a similar spooky atmosphere.
Okay, cool. I'll check that one out. Any others?
Yeah, if they're interested in that idea of, a character not knowing they're a ghost, I'd say check out The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. It's a bit more mature, but it deals with those themes in a really powerful way.
Awesome. Those are some great recommendations. We'll be sure to include those in the show notes for our listeners. All right, well, I think we've officially cracked the case on The Ghost Next Door, wouldn't you say? We've explored the twist, the characters, the emotional depth, the creepy setting, even those little hints that Stine was dropping all along. What more could there be?
Well, actually, there's one more thing I'd like to leave you with, something to think about as revisit the story.
Ooh, okay, hit me with it.
Imagine you're Hannah, right? You're back as a ghost, but you know your time is limited. What would be your priority? Like, would you try to right past wrongs, maybe prevent that fire that took your life? Or would you focus on protecting someone you care about, even if it means sacrificing your own peace?
Wow, that's a heavy question. I mean, it really makes you think, what would you do in that situation?
It really goes beyond the story itself. It makes you consider your own values and stuff, right?
Exactly. It's crazy that R.L. Stine can make you think about all this deep stuff, all within a Goosebumps book.
It's a testament to his skill as a writer. He really knows how to tap into those deeper fears and anxieties that we all have.
Well, there you have it, folks.
Yeah.
We did it again. Another deep dive successfully completed. We uncovered the secrets of The Ghost Next Door, answered some burning questions, and hopefully inspired you to revisit this classic or maybe even check out some of those other books we recommended.
And if this deep dive sparked your curiosity about ghost stories or even just made you think about life and death and all that, then I think we've accomplished our mission.
Until next time, keep those pages turning, keep those lights on, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that stay with you long after you've finished reading.